Hello and welcome to our next lesson. This is going to be on the urinary system. So the urinary system contains just a few organs. We have the kidneys, which you have two of. You have two ureters, which is the tube that enters and exits the kidneys that bring urine to the urinary bladder. And then from the urinary bladder, we have the urethra, which allows us to expel waste outside of the body. So what are some of the functions of the urinary system? The kidneys are actually going to filter gallons of bloods a minute, and in doing so, they can return items to the blood that we want to keep and we need, and then anything else that we have, like waste and excess ions, we're able to just expel as waste in the urine. So where are the kidneys located? They lie against the dorsal body wall, and they're literally stuck to the side of the dorsal body wall. They extend from about T11 to T12 all the way down to your L3, which means they do get protection from that lower rib cage. And the adult kidney is about 5 inches long, 2.5 inches wide, and about 1 inch thick. So if we look here, here's kind of the back view of the kidney, and you can see how it is protected by that T11 and T12. And you'll notice the left kidney is actually raised up a little bit more compared to the right side of the kidney, and that's just because the stomach is kind of located in this area. And then you can see over here, here is our kidneys, the ureter, which goes down to the urinary bladder, and then out the urethra. So now we're going to talk about the structures of the urinary system. So the renal hilum is the part of the kidney where items enter and exit. If you look at a kidney, it kind of does look like a shape of a bean, and the indentation of the bean is where we have the ureters and your blood vessels and nerves come through. Atop each kidney is your adrenal gland, which, if you remember, is the gland that is responsible for releasing epinephrine or adrenaline. Surrounding each kidney, you have a fibrous capsule, which, if you look at a bean again, you can actually kind of peel off the outer layer of a bean. That's kind of exactly what this is. It's kind of just holding everything kind of in place, and it gives it a nice shiny appearance. Then you have tons of fat surrounding the kidney. That's what the perirenal fat capsule is. Anytime you see this word renal right here, it's referencing the kidney and the urinary system. So renal is kind of that kidney term. And then your outermost layer is the renal fascia, which kind of is that really tough connective tissue layer that kind of holds it up against that dorsal body wall. So you have a nice fibrous capsule holding everything together, fat capsule for cushions, and then a really thick connective tissue holding it against the wall. So the kidneys are kind of unique in that they have two layers. So when you cut a kidney open, if you do like a sagittal or a frontal cut on a kidney and divide it into anterior and posterior parts, the cortex is what's considered the outer region of the kidney, and it's a little lighter in color. And then the medulla is more deep to the cortex, and it has like almost a reddish terracotta brown kind of color to it. And within this renal medulla, we have what we call renal pyramids and renal columns. So the renal pyramids literally do look like a triangle and give the renal medulla kind of a striped appearance. And then the columns are just the tissue that are in between the pyramids. So if we look here at this picture, this would be the cortex here. This would be the medulla in here. Okay, this structure is going to be the renal pyramid. You can kind of see how it's triangular in structure. And then in between here would be a renal column. Then we have what we call the renal pelvis. This is the part of the kidney that connects to the ureter, and we're going to kind of go big to small here. So this is our biggest kind of structure here that connects to the ureter. And then these calyces right here are the extensions of the pelvis, and they actually take urine that's been formed by that cortex and medulla portion of the kidney, and the urine will actually drain into these calyces, and then the calyces dump the urine into the renal pelvis, and then the urine finally travels into the ureters, which go to the bladder. So if we look here, it's much easier to see all these structures when you look at a picture. Here is your renal pelvis. So see how it's connected to the actual ureter here. And then these are going to be your calyces. So what's happening is we have urine kind of forming in this area here. And so then once the urine is formed, it literally will travel down and collect in these little cups right here, these calyces, and then it will travel into the renal pelvis and then out the ureter. And I love this picture and the kidney is one of my favorite things to dissect because I feel like you can see the structures really, really easily. So this kind of gray tissue here, that's going to be the cortex. And this is where you have a lot of blood flow happening. This is where you're actually kind of forming the urine. The urine will then travel into these renal pyramids. See the nice triangular structure? Where they will be dumped into various calyces that are right here. The calyces will go into the renal pelvis, which then go into the ureter. Just really cool. And here they've labeled a renal column, very easy to see in between the pyramids. So now our blood supply. Blood supply is really important when we look at the kidneys because this is where all of your blood is being filtered. So we have to talk about where this blood flow is kind of coming from, how does it split up, how does it finally get to a capillary bed. So the kidneys obviously have an extremely rich blood supply because they're actually filtering the blood. And 1/4 of your blood passes through your kidneys each single minute. So first we'll talk about the renal artery. We're going to go from big to small. So the biggest artery is the renal artery. This is the artery that's going right into the renal hilum. It's going just pretty much straight in. And then it's going to divide into what we call segmental arteries once it enters into the renal hilum. These segmental arteries are going to branch off even further into our interlobal arteries, which travel actually through the renal columns to go into the renal cortex. So if you're labeling these, this is your largest, this is your second largest, those branch off into these are your third largest. So we're getting a lot smaller. So we have renal artery, branches into the segmental arteries, which are actually now entering into the kidney and the hilum. Then you have the interlobal arteries, which are going to travel through the renal columns. Those interlobal arteries are going to branch off into what we call arcuate arteries. And this is our fourth one then. And these actually curve over the pyramids. And then finally, our smallest little arteries are going to be what we call the cortical radiate arteries. And these are the ones that are going to be going up into the cortex tissue. So if we look here, this is a great job, and we don't really get into the veins because the veins are named the same. So just like you have a renal artery, you also have a renal vein. So a lot of them just go hand in hand. There's a interlobal artery and an interlobal vein. So I just hit on the arteries because the veins are named the same. So here's your renal artery. That's going to split into our segmental arteries. Remember that was our number 2. Those are going to branch off into interlobal arteries, which go up through the renal columns. Those are going to branch off into these little guys here that actually curve over the pyramids. Those are your arcuate arteries. And then finally, all these little tiny, 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 tiny arteries going into the actual cortex are called the cortical radiate arteries. So make sure you can kind of start naming those 1 through 5, maybe 1 starting with the largest and 5 going to the smallest. So the big topic of the urinary system is this word here, a nephron. Don't forget this word. This is a huge, 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 like, boom word. Okay, nephron. Like, I'm just literally drawing around it because that's how important it is. So the nephrons are the structural and functional unit of a kidney. You literally have millions of these microscopic nephrons in kidneys, and these are the guys that are responsible for forming urine. This is where the urine is actually made in the kidney. And you have two major structures that make up this nephron. First is what we call the glomerulus. This is, when I say a knot of capillaries, it legitimately looks like a ball of yarn that's just been knotted up, and those are capillaries through there. Then that glomerulus leads to what we call the renal tubule, and in this renal tubule is where all of our filtration occurs. So we're going to get into all the different structures of a renal tubule before we get into how it works. So the glomerulus is really the knot of capillaries, and then surrounding that knot of capillaries you have what's called a Bowman's capsule. And inside the Bowman's capsule, you have what's called podocytes. These are really cool cells that have really long branching processes, and this allows the glomerulus to kind of push all the solutes out into the renal tubule. So after this Bowman's capsule and after the glomerulus, the rest of the renal tubule is only about 1.5 inches long, but it's microscopic. So when you think about 1.5 inches, you're thinking, oh, that's not really that long, but this tube is microscopic, so it's actually ginormous. And this tube coils and twists until it reaches what we call a collecting duct. And those collecting ducts are pretty much what's going to be connected to the calyces and then the renal pelvis and etc. And there's three major parts to a renal tubule. You have the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. So proximal means, remember, closer. So this is going to be the closest to the glomerulus, and this is going to be the farthest away. And when I show you a picture of this, it's going to make much, much, much more sense. So this is a nephron. It is a crazy looking structure, and literally inside this structure is where your urine is formed. So here is let's start at the beginning. Here's our cortical radiate artery. Remember we talked about these guys? These are really small. They're kind of going up into the cortex. Then what happens is we push all of our blood into this glomerulus here. See how it literally is a knot of capillaries? It looks like a ball of capillaries. We push kind of everything out into this renal tubule. Okay, this kind of skin tone colored thing is your renal tubule. So what happens is everything from our blood, all of our solutes and everything is going to enter into the proximal convoluted tubule here. And it's going to travel around. And we're going to talk about all the things that happen in here, but right now just know that the proximal convoluted tubule is going to take everything that's come out of your blood and is going to dip it down into the loop of Henle, which is our next one. So we have proximal convoluted tubule and then our loop of Henle here. Then the solutes are going to travel up into what we call the distal convoluted tubule. And by the time it gets here, pretty much everything that we want to become urine is going to be urine, and it's going to head into this collecting duct. So by the time we get here, it's considered urine. So we're going to take a break here, and then we will start to talk about how nephrons work and the actual really important part of how urine is actually formed.